The next chapter is culture and heritage. This is a chapter that largely deals with physical heritage, such as artifacts and remains, and the First Nations' interests in those. The chapter is divided up into different topics. First, it deals with control of culture and heritage on Treaty Settlement land. And essentially, the system is designed to give the First Nation a very high level of control over Treaty Settlement land and culture and heritage on Treaty Settlement land, unless for some reason there is a police investigation or a coroner's investigation, for example, if human remains are found. Thus, if human remains are found or an artifact is found on Treaty Settlement land, unless it can be shown that it actually belongs to somebody else, so there's a clear claimant or family who has a connection to it, it will be the First Nation government that will determine the degree to which those remains can be disturbed, how those remains will be managed, how those artifacts will be managed, and they can make laws to deal with those matters. The next thing that the chapter deals with is the return of artifacts, first from the Museum of Civilization, as it used to be called. It's now, I think, the Museum of History. That's the Federal Museum in Ottawa, and the return of artifacts from the Royal BC Museum. And essentially what the agreement contemplates is that between agreement in principle and final, there will be a negotiation about any artifacts that are identified as belonging to a First Nation or a First Nations person who comes from one of your First Nations. And a determination will be made whether that artifact should be returned to the community or remain at the BC Museum or remain at the Museum of Civilization. There are not a lot of artifacts that are listed as belonging to your communities. There are many Salish artifacts which came from other Salish communities, but there are some. And the question for each community will be the degree to which they want to negotiate having those artifacts brought back and proper facilities built to store them, which can be quite expensive, or alternatively entering into arrangements with, for example, the BC Museum to be able to access those articles. The next major section deals with place naming, and there's an agreement that the First Nations and British Columbia can negotiate new place names for locations in southern Vancouver Island or within the traditional territories of the First Nation. Those negotiations need to get started soon, and there's a real opportunity here to rename or possibly name for the first time important locations using your names for those locations. The final section deals with off-treaty settlement land culture and heritage, so remains or artifacts found off Treaty Settlement land, which are presently governed by the Heritage Conservation Act. And essentially what the agreement is that there's a recognition that the First Nations will have a continued interest in those artifacts and those remains, and that between agreement in principle and final, there will be a further negotiation about how that interest will be dealt with.